to say good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are, whichever time zone you are joining from. You're most welcome, and when we do trust that we will have a very fruitful session today. Before we move on with introducing the speakers and the program for today, I'll hand over to Emma just to walk us through a few housekeeping rules.
Thank you, Boris. So today's session is offered in English. So obviously we're speaking in English, but you can also follow along in French and or Spanish. To do so, you can enable the interpretation by going to the bottom of your screen and clicking on the little planet icon. And from there, choose your preferred language, either English, French, or Spanish. And once you've made your selection, you can mute the original audio unless you want to hear both languages simultaneously. So it's a Zoom meeting, so please do keep your microphone muted if you're not speaking. Feel free to turn on your video at any time. And as we're using interpretation, please speak slowly so our interpreters have the time to translate. Thank you very much. Over to you, Boris.
Thanks a lot, Emma. And I see that people keep joining. We will start with presentations in a few minutes' time. And so once again, a warm welcome and big thanks to all of you who have a spared and saved time for this webinar. This is highly appreciated. This is one in a series of regional webinars that we organize in preparation for upcoming UNFCCC COP. That is to present IUCN's position paper on the COP and also share some information here from you. And so IUCN we tried to be quite diligent and ahead of the time to prepare this position paper, and the position paper was prepared in consultation across IUCN, of course, a membership and commissions. And this is a result of it. We feel quite a strong and to the point position paper. So we organize these regional webinars to socialize with the position paper, and of course, and once again, if there are any reflections and comments, we'd be very happy to take them on board. This is one thing to do, and another one is just to say that IUCN will have a rather strong and visible presence at COP. We will have a pavilion which will operate throughout the COP, where we'll be staging a number of events and presentations and workshops and discussions on topical issues. So that will be one particular venue where IUCN will be presenting its position, will be presenting its knowledge, its standards, and will organize rounds of discussions. So that is one specific issue. But certainly that this webinar is to present the position paper itself, and then we will have time for questions and answers. So that's something that leads me to introducing our speakers for today, which is a very distinguished a group of experts that we have. So we start with Christina Voigt, and Christina is chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. So she will be presenting the position paper itself, after which we will move into a Q&A session. So a Q&A session will be facilitated by Tracy Farrell, and Tracy is our regional director for North American regional office. And after which we will have some closing remarks, and closing remarks will be given by Maher, who is the director of IUCN's Mediterranean Cooperation Center for Mediterranean, based in Spain. So these are the speakers for today. But I can say freely that all of you participants, that you are equally so speakers. Yeah. So this is meant to be interactive. So please, after the presentation of the position paper, we will open for questions and answers, some remarks and comments. Yeah, and every comment is welcome. Yeah. So this is pretty much what we prepared today, and then hopefully we'll also have similar webinars for other key events that IUCN is actually actively attending to. So without further ado, and not wanting to take more of your time, then I will invite Christina to walk us through the position paper that is available online, that is fully accessible, but still to walk us through, and then give the floor for discussion. And before I stop and turn myself off, just to say that there is also it's a group of people behind who you might not see today that are very instrumental in developing this position paper, and will be equally so a quite instrumental key to running IUCN through the proceedings of the COP. So, Christina, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Boris. And also from my side, a very warm hello and welcome to everyone who joins us here today on the brief briefing on the IUCN positions for COP28 and CMA 5, the big this year's climate summit that will take place in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates from the 30th of November to the 12th of December. And as Boris already indicated, the IUCN this year was in a very good position to very early on agree on its key positions for this year's COP. That was done basically to, as Boris already alluded to socialize these positions among the IUCN family, but also out there to parties and stakeholders in this process. Now, this process to get to the IUCN positions was done in a very diligent and inclusive manner. There was an IUCN COP28 working group that was established right after summer. We met several times online. The group consisted of council members as well as members of the secretariats, and as council members also several commission chairs. As you know, there are now 7 commissions, and most of them were involved in defining the positions. All the commissions were involved at some point to review drafts of the position paper, as well as to give additional input in formalizing the positions. Now, the draft was reviewed and eventually approved by the IUCN PPC, the Council Program on Policy Program and Policy Committee. Then it went to the Bureau, and eventually it was signed up by the Director General. It was launched in early September, and you see the position paper here on the right side of the slide, ahead of the United Nations General Assembly High-Level Week on Climate Change, in all 3 languages, so it's accessible worldwide early on, right in front of the of this year's COP. And it also is important to understand the position, and we have 10 key positions which I will present very briefly against, or in the context within which they were adopted. One is, of course, the IPCC's 6th assessment report, which with its 3 working groups were published over the last 2 years. But as you perhaps know, this year, the synthesis report was published, and that synthesis report, of course, brings together that monumental work that lies in those thousands of pages of the 6th assessment report, and it will be very instrumental, of course, also in the context of this year's COP, but it is one of the background contexts against which the positions were conceived. Of course, another contextual elements are the climate impacts that we are continuously seeing worldwide, whether it is forest fires or floods. And against those widespread impacts and against rising losses and damages, the position paper was drafted. And the third element that we would like to put out here up front is, of course, the core element of this year's COP, and that is the first global stocktake that will take place, or that will be finished this year in Dubai. As you perhaps know, the global stocktake is one core design architectural element of the Paris Agreement. It will take place every 5 years, and it is for the first time this year. Next time is 2028, and so forth. And the whole point of the global stocktake is to take stock of collective progress towards the 3 goals of the Paris Agreement, and then inform the next round of nationally determined contributions and other actions, and enhance them in light of the outcomes of the global stocktake. So that's the context against which the IUCN developed and adopted its 10 key priorities for COP28. Next. Now I'll briefly run through all 3 of them. The first one is a time-bound phase-out of all fossil fuels, including oil and gas, as well as fossil fuel subsidies, in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and that within the framework of just transition. You may recall that already in Glasgow, but then also repeated last year, there is a call to phase down unabated coal, and it is in a way a logical continuation of that policy that is already part and parcel of COP decisions, to include all fossil fuels beyond coal, and to call for a global phase out. And we already know that current temperature increases are already at a level of 1.1 degrees. So if 1.5 is supposed to stay alive, then it's very clear that additional emissions due to burning of fossil fuels, and all of them are not something that the atmosphere can tolerate. Global greenhouse gas emissions, we all know, must be reduced by 43% by 2030. That's only 7 years from now, down to net zero around 2050, and stay net negative thereafter. And in order to stay a chance to reach that target, that's the global pathways of emissions aligned with 1.5 degrees. It is very important to get down to these markers as soon as possible. The current levels of nationally determined contributions, NDCs, are not ambitious enough. We know that, and this first position of the IUCN is, of course, to increase also global ambition reflected in the NDCs. 1.5 degrees is what the IUCN supports in the context of the climate goals, and that in the context also of course, maintaining critical ecosystem services, minimizing climate-related losses and damages, in the knowledge that once we look at overshooting, these ecosystems may be at risk. Next slide. The second position, I'm sorry, is related to the global stocktake, which I already mentioned. And it requires that the first global stocktake should deliver strong and clear outputs at COP28, and those outputs then should also result in more ambitious NDCs in 2025. 2025 is the year when successive NDCs need to be communicated by all parties. So it's a very important year, and the global stocktake in 2023 is designed to deliver information and data for this process in 2025 in order to inform parties on possibilities for progress. So the global stocktake has that critical function to increase ambition across mitigation, adaptation, and finance. The IUCN, the global stocktake is a multi-year process. It only finishes now this year in 2023. As you see from the right side of the slide, it already started in 2021. It will finish this year with the outcome being presented and perhaps most likely negotiated at COP28. But most important is then the linkage between the outcome and the next round of NDCs. And the IUCN has been involved in this multi-year process in many of the events, especially the technical dialogues, where Sandeep Sengupta, who is here with us today, has been very present to talk about the role of nature-based solution and ecosystem protection. Next slide, please. The third position looks at a strong reinforcement of the interlinkage between climate and biodiversity crises, and in this context calls upon the recognition of the role of nature-based solution and the need for greater synergies across all three Rio Conventions, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Convention to address desertification. Now, already last year, the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh recognized the interlinked global crises of climate change and biodiversity loss, and in this context also recognized the vital importance of nature and ecosystems for effective climate action. It was a very important outcome from last year's COP for the IUCN, because the IUCN delegation had worked consistently over many years to get parties to recognize that very important linkage. And finally, last year, that was explicitly mentioned in the cover decisions from the COP and the CMA, which I referred to there in the first bullet point. Now, what is now our position for this year is, of course, to build upon last year's recognition and to move it forward, that the COP would reinforce and build on these terms from last year and contextualize them and include them in more specific work, for example, in the global stocktake, of course, but also in other branches of the work under the COP, for example, the mitigation work program, under which every year two specific dialogues, technical dialogues are being organized. We would like to see one of these dialogues focusing on the interlinkage between climate and biodiversity crisis, but also in the context of the adaptation work program, the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal of adaptation. Our message here is that nature-based solutions provide immediate and near-term benefits, both for mitigation and adaptation, but also support other goals of the biodiversity framework, in particular under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Frameworks, as well as the wider goals expressed in the Sustainable Development Goals. Next. The fourth position is that parties should reflect their highest possible ambition in developing their next or future NDCs by incorporating concrete and ambitious nature-based solutions in them. As I already mentioned, last year, parties were explicitly encouraged to consider as appropriate nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approaches, taking into consideration the United Nations Environmental Assembly resolution from last year, which for the first time recognized nature-based solution in their mitigation and adaptation action. This particular paragraph that is repeated here in the first bullet point is the first time ever that the COP recognized nature-based solution as a concept in the entire United Nations climate regime. It again was one of the very important outcomes for IUCN and IUCN's work from last year's COP. The latest available analysis shows that 41 of the 122 NDCs, which represent more than 50 countries that were submitted in 2021, have explicitly referred to nature-based solution, or it becomes a currency, it becomes a concept, it becomes a mitigation and adaptation tool in many countries' climate action. Parties should also include nature-based solutions in their national adaptation plans, not just in their NDCs, as well as in their long-term low-emission development strategies, which are supposed to be the long-term strategies for mid-century, so 2050, which are also part of the Paris Agreement, referred to in Article 4, paragraph 19. And in this context, of course, the IUCN is developing and supplying several knowledge materials. We included here the nature-based solutions in nationally determined contribution, as well as blue carbon and NDCs. Next slide. The fifth policy point is to call for scaled up global finance, climate finance, and cross the entire continuum from mitigation to adaptation to loss and damage, including for high integrity nature-based solutions that also bid increased direct access for indigenous peoples and local communities. And that continuum of mitigation, adaptation, loss, and damage is something very important that we highlight throughout the entire position paper, because of course the less we do on mitigation, the more has to be done on adaptation, the higher is the risk of losses and damage. And so these three elements have to be seen as a continuum, and in each one of them, nature-based solutions play a significant role. And of course, finance for nature-based solutions. Currently, we know that the global goal to mobilize $100 billion annually from 2020 on has not been met. Hopefully, it will be met this year, but we urgently demand of parties to meet it. But this also has to be seen against the background of the negotiations of a new collective quantified goal on future climate finance, which is supposed to be adopted next year. And for that new goal, we do know that $100 billion is the floor. We don't know where the ceiling is right now, but we hope and we demand that finance will be allocated across that continuum that we described in the beginning. We also need to see rapidly increasing adaptation finance to achieve a balance between mitigation and adaptation. And of course, we have to see the funding arrangements for loss and damage that were adopted last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, including the Loss and Damage Response Fund, to be rapidly operationalized. And adopting the more detailed rules for that fund is on this year's agenda for the COP. We also need to see increasing investments in nature-based solutions. They should preferably threefold by 2030 and fourfold by 2050. You see that in the slide to the right, in order to meet the demands across the entire continuum on nature-based solution or funding for nature-based solutions. And of course, as I already mentioned, increased funding for indigenous peoples and local communities who currently receive less than 1% of climate finance. Next slide. The sixth position is not so much on policy making, but on the implementation of nature-based solutions in both market and non-market-based approaches through the applications of the standards that IUCN developed for nature-based solution, in particular the global standard for nature-based solution. That standard, the IUCN Global Standard for NBS, offers 8 criteria and 28 specific indicators to enable a coherent design, but also implementation, and then finally evaluation of nature-based solutions. In the context of nature-based solutions and market approaches, we very strongly put out forward the position that nature-based solution must not function as a substitute, or as a means to postpone ambitious greenhouse gas emission reduction efforts. That needs to remain the priority, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but only in situations that the nature-based solution could compensate is in the context of remaining or residual or hard to abate emissions that otherwise would be very difficult to reduce or abate it. In this context, nature-based solutions could come in for offsetting purposes, but they should not substitute very important and drastic and immediate emission reductions. There's also a need to ensure highest level of environmental and ecosystem integrity in the operationalization of Article 6. That's the article that deals with market approaches under the Paris Agreement. Here, through a robust accounting system, but also the development of safeguards for environmental and social considerations. Next slide, please. The 7th position looks at or demands the accelerated and responsible deployment of renewable energy systems in the context of a just transition and net positive biodiversity impacts. This has to be seen against the deployment of large-scale technological solutions like wind farms and solar farms. The IPBES in its 2021 report noted that these large-scale technological measures may threaten biodiversity, and they need to be evaluated in terms of their overall benefits and risks. And at the same time, that transition towards renewable energy systems has to be just. It has to avoid any detrimental impacts on communities, on ecosystems, on indigenous peoples, on species, and so forth, by pursuing net positive impacts aligned with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And here we point to a publication by the IUCN. It's an IUCN guide for mitigating the biodiversity impacts associated with solar and wind energy development, where these conflicts may come forward, and gives guidance on how to mitigate them. The future work on IUCN guidance will look at optimal spatial planning and cumulative impact assessment for the renewable energy sector. Next slides, please. The 8th position demands to avoid the overshoot of the 1.5 degree threshold, and warns against relying on unproven, untested, and unregulated geoengineering technologies to reach net zero goals. As you perhaps know, the IPCC 6th Assessment Synthesis Report talks about the eventual possibility of overshooting 1.5 degrees in order to get back to 1.5 degrees. In that context, it is going to be very important to avoid adverse and potentially irreversible impacts on human systems and natural systems that may happen by overshooting 1.5 degrees. 1.5 need to remain the overall threshold, because it will trigger significant biophysical consequences, for example, climate tipping points like the collapse of the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets or thawing of permafrost. Now, in this context of what happens if overshooting should occur, or in order to avoid overshooting, the discourse is slowly turning in different corners worldwide on looking at geoengineering technologies, in particular solar geoengineering technologies. And in this context, the IUCN warns or demands a precautionary approach that needs to be taken with regard to geoengineering, given that these technologies come with very high and unproven, very high risks and unproven technologies. There is a moral hazard, of course, in having a technological fix available that may delay the very important and necessary emission reductions in greenhouse gases, but also the significant social and environmental risks that are not entirely understood, that can only be understood if these technologies are deployed at scale, but then it may be too late. And there are unresolved issues around the ethics, consent, equity, and governance, as well as legal regulations of these various different technologies of geoengineering, in particular solar geoengineering. Next slide, please. The second last position is on equitable and inclusive climate policy and action, incorporating the priorities, concerns, needs, and rights of those that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, in particular local communities and indigenous peoples, women, youth, migrants, and so forth. In this context, the IUCN supports the work of the United Nations Framework Convention's platform for local communities and indigenous peoples, as well as provide support for the meaningful engagement of IPLCs, both on the national and international level, in the development of climate policy, as well as in their implementation through systems that seek at respecting their traditional knowledge and of course indigenous and local communities' rights. That also deals with addressing the risk that vulnerable communities may face from climate-related displacement, and migration displacement could be both internally and externally in migration then when crossing an internationally recognized boundary. We look at mainstreaming gender-responsive climate policies in actions to close the gender gap, both in formulating policies as well as their implementation, as well as ensuring intergenerational and intra-generational equity, intergenerational in particular, with respect to rights of future generations. And the last slide on the 10 positions. The final IUCN position for COP28 deals with ambitious action for non-party stakeholders, including the private sector and civil society, in addressing the climate and biodiversity interlinked crises and supporting a just transition. And of course, it is no secret that the IUCN president, Mrs. Razan Al Mubarak, is also the high-level champion, one of the two high-level champions. The other one is Dr. Mahmoud Moyeldin. She is one of the high-level champions under the Marrakesh Partnership, and is, of course, a very important function that she will carry out in the context of this year's COP, where there is, of course, an important ally with her function as the IUCN president. And finally, we support collaboration in nature-related thematic areas across the different scopes of land use, ocean, coastal zones, water, and so forth, working closely together with the private sector and civil society. And just one final slide on what is going to happen. Next slide, please. In Dubai, and Boris already alluded to, there are several planned activities, a number of regional webinars like this one to socialize these positions amongst IUCN's family and stakeholders. The pavilion, very important aspect of IUCN's work at COP28 is called Unite for Nature. Within and without or outside the IUCN, it will bring together the IUCN family as well as important stakeholders. But this is not all. The delegation, the IUCN delegation in Dubai, is there also to engage in key formal processes under the UNFCCC, that is the Global Stocktake Mitigation Work Program, the Global Goal and Adaptation, and the platform, the Local Community and Indigenous People Platform, and many others, where the IUCN is an observer and is active in these negotiations. The ENACT partnership that was inaugurated last year is just about to publish a report on the state of nature-based solution, which will hopefully be influential in all discussions on nature-based solutions. I already mentioned support to the COP28 presidency on nature-based or nature-related priorities as the presidency has set them out. We also engage in regional climate weeks in the UN summits that happen on the run-up to COP28, as well as the IUCN Leaders Forum, which just took place earlier this month. So we just encourage you to engage in the Q&As that will start in 1 second, but also please share the IUCN position paper with your networks, with the UNFCCC focal points, so that it is being socialized and the messages are carried out to everyone who is interested in them. Also include the IUCN messages and positions in your own outreach and campaigns. And please let us know if you happen to be in Dubai at any time during COP28. Please support us on site, and you're very welcome to visit, of course, the IUCN Pavilion. And with that, I give the floor back, I think, to Tracy, to Boris, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christina. It was incredibly helpful and a great overview. And thank you very much to the World Commission on Environmental Law, an excellent partner within the IUCN and working closely with the Secretariat and Council. I'm the North America Regional Director for IUCN, part of the Secretariat. I'm based in sunny at the moment, Washington, D.C. on a very spooky Halloween day. And so just maybe a bit of reflections on what we just heard. So big top line, keep 1.5 alive. This is where we have to get to. And the reduction of fossil fuel emissions and the mitigation and adaptation solutions required behind that. Also increasing ambition. So we need to do better with the NDCs, and this has to address mitigation and adaptation, and the idea of including nature-based solutions at the heart of that, not as a replacement for emissions reductions, but as an important part of the solution. The linkage between the Rio Conventions and trying to get biodiversity more a part of the center of that focus, recognizing that we have to address the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. Scaled up finance and direct access to financing for Indigenous people and local communities. Implementation of NBS following the IUCN standards. Also responsible deployment of just renewable energy and avoiding the risky technological fixes. So, and last but not least, certainly equitable and inclusive climate policy in action. So we're really excited to launch these messages, and we hope you've been able to see the paper. Please let us know if you need access to it. And this session also is being recorded, so you can listen to it again and share it with your colleagues. So now I'd love to open the floor, and maybe I could ask my colleagues, Emma, to help me recognize folks, and I'll see as hands pop up. I'll ask you to speak, and please introduce yourself and your affiliation and pose either your question or reflection. So first I see Joshua Sarnoff. Please go ahead and unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
So I'm Joshua Sarnoff. I'm a professor at DePaul University in Chicago. I also live in DC. First, I want to thank you. I mean, it's obviously a terrific statement, but I also think it fails to recognize adequately the reality of where we are. The World Meteorological Organization said there's a 66% likelihood that annual average near-surface global temperatures between 2023 and 2027 will be more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So we have to acknowledge that, Paris has essentially failed. And we need to say something that's much stronger than what is in this statement about the inadequacy of funding for mitigation, the inadequacy of the measures to try to phase out. Again, those estimates may not take into account some of the feedback loops, including methane. Second, we clearly need to address, and it does, but it doesn't put numbers on it, the massive inadequacy of loss and damage funds to address the impacts, including the fact that, funds don't replace actual losses. So you have the implications for vulnerable people, including migration. And third, there's nothing stated about pandemic disease in relationship to zoonosis and global economic losses that need to provide an opportunity cost to shift funding to prevent those impacts now. So the main message I'm trying to get is it's a terrific statement, but it simply doesn't address the reality that we face. We need to make a much stronger statement. And the fact that the governments may not be willing to commit to more should not stop a group like this from making a clear statement that they need to, even if they don't. That's it.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Josh. Maybe I'll take a couple of questions, reflections, and then ask the panel to respond. So are there other questions, reflections? And feel free to raise your hand. Or perhaps if anyone wants to share any plans that you have for COP28 or key messages that you're planning on promoting, and we can coordinate with you either directly there or in prep, because we're also looking to figure out who's attending, who's doing what, and make sure that we have some key meetings. So please feel free to share any of your kind of pertinent updates or issues you'd like to see addressed. All right, well, maybe while folks are thinking and putting on their caps for that, maybe their witch hats, Christina, would you like to start by taking a whack at Josh's inputs and comments, and perhaps also Sandeep, if you also want to comment?
Yeah, sure. I mean, thanks for these comments, and they're very pertinent. I've just very brief 4 points to respond. I think one issue we probably need to be a bit careful about is to state Paris has failed. Most of the processes under Paris are just about to start, and I think it would be a bit early to say it has failed if we don't even give it a chance. The whole point of Paris is to get parties to where they need to be. And I think comments like this are very important to get parties to really step up their game in those processes that are just about to start through the global stocktake, and in particular to the next round of NDCs that are due in 2025, which have to step up in the level of ambition to the highest possible ambition that every party can put forward. And I think having a reminder like this in that process is very important. But in order to do that, we need Paris, and we should not undermine it, I think. And that's also one of the positions that the IUCN takes. In terms of the overshoot, I think, again, very right. We may look at an overshoot. I indicated that, and it was very clear to IUCN when we worked on these positions. But in the context of overshooting and hopefully getting back to 1.5, that is where the deployment of geotechnological solutions may have to come in to stay realistically, as you said. But what does it mean? Which technologies should be deployed? What kind of precaution should be required of those that deploy them? There was this example that I showed in one of those slides. To what extent can they be proven? What safeguards need to be around certain technologies, be it direct air capture, be it carbon capture and storage, and so forth. But in the context of potential overshoot, this is where some of the discourses go, and where also the IUCN is engaged in alluding to the need to be careful and precautionate. The Loss and Damage Fund has no money yet at all. I think that point is well taken, and we included it in our positions. The fund was only established this year. Hopefully more detailed rules will be adopted of who is going to pay into this fund, who is able to receive money, and for what. And having parties agree on these important rules is absolutely crucial, and we included it as well in our positions. And the fourth point on zoonosis, very important. In this context, for the first time ever, there is a health day this year at the COP, where this linkage between climate change, spreading in diseases, but also biodiversity and linkage to zoonosis and spreading of virus from the wild to humans is at the one point of the discussion, and I'm sure the IUCN will be there at the Health Day in order to also shed light on that important aspect that you raised.
Great, thank you, Christina. Sorry, I was clicking myself off of mute. Yeah, and I think that we, that collectively we would all certainly need and like to see more, and that 1.5 alive is kind of the full stop. And obviously, if we're not going to reach that, then I think we have to significantly revise and review, well, where do we go from there? And what are we going to do with we're having the global stock take, but the 2025, that target is there, that next timestamp. So we need to work on all of these key messages and probably have some good review and input after COP28, figure out where we go. So that will be critical as well. And then in the lineup to the next World Conservation Congress, and what kinds of statements do we want coming out of that collectively from the members, and where the members would like to see us go, and how we can collectively put these key messages forward and make them as powerful as they need to be. So are there any other questions or reflections? If not, we can actually move a bit early then to ask, I'd love to ask my colleague, Maher Mahjoub, if you would please bring us home to give us some closing thoughts and remarks, and then we will end the session for the day.
Hi, Maher. Sorry, you're muted. Can you mute yourself, please? Thank you.
Oh, perhaps we're having some sound difficulties. Sandeep?
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. Maybe while we figure out we wait for Maher to come back online, I just wanted to take the opportunity also to share an additional piece of information, because I think the previous question that we heard was a very important one. Also to ask about, the connections between biodiversity and health. And in that regard, I wanted to share that IUCN has actually got together with WHO to set up an expert working group precisely to look into these interlinkages between biodiversity, climate, and health. And as Christina pointed out, one of the things that we're very much hoping to do in the Health Day of COP28 is to explore these opportunities a little more. So thank you for that question.
Great, and thank you for adding that information. Okay, great. We have Maher. Please take it away.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry for the technical problem. So I would like to thank my colleagues, Boris, Christina, and Tracy, Sandeep, for putting together this event as an information webinar for our colleagues, members, and the Commission members of IUCN. I think it's a very good opportunity to come together as a union, secretariat, members of IUCN and Commission members, to look at our preparation for such strategic and important COP28 that will be celebrated in 3 weeks or 4 weeks from now. We need to share our message. We need to build a strong voice together to have more impact and to influence the societies, the private sector, the public sector also, as it is on the core of the mission and the vision of IUCN as a union. And this event for me is an excellent opportunity to share the message, the 10 message that we developed in consultation with our members and the commission members, so that as a union, the 3 pillars of the union could go to this event with this kind of background to help share these messages among the audience, among the participants, and build on them so they can be implemented later on at national level within their organization and within their countries. So I think we need to continue with this kind of gathering that that include all the IUCN constituents, secretariat members and commissioners for the preparation of other strategic events. Besides COP28, we have the World Conservation Congress that my colleagues mentioned before, that will take place, as you know, in Abu Dhabi in October 2025. So the COP28 could also be set the scene for to develop the next IUCN program, to develop specific motions that could become either resolution or recommendation for IUCN. So the message that I would like to share is that each event is not an isolated event, either COP28 or World Conservation Congress. We should find the kind of linkages. They should be, they should influence each other. They should build on the outcomes of each other to set up the right activities, the right actions that could help us as a society find the right solutions to the several challenges we are facing, either the biodiversity crisis or climate change or any societal challenges that we are facing. So I hope that this webinar was useful for all the participants coming from Europe and North America. We wish you a successful participation in Dubai for the COP28, and please do visit the IUCN pavilion and do participate in IUCN events, so our voice as a union could be stronger and more impactful. So without further ado, I thank you again all for your interest and your availability to attend this event, and I hope that we will find other opportunities to see each other and to continue this exchange on several other items and subjects. Thank you very much. Thank you.